A 12-year-old boy bursts into a courtroom in tears, claiming his father is innocent of a crime that's torn their lives apart. But what happens next will shock you. He uncovers a truth so powerful, it changes everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories like this. The courtroom was unusually quiet, a heavy silence hanging in the air as everyone waited for the next case to begin. The judge, a poised and experienced woman named Judge Amelia Parker, sat at the bench, her gavel held firmly in her hand. The case of Marcus Turner, a man accused of embezzling millions from a charity organization, was in its final stages. The courtroom was filled with a sense of anticipation, the tension palpable as both sides prepared for the closing arguments. Outside, a faint sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder by the second. Without warning, the courtroom doors swung open, and a young boy, no older than 12, ran into the room. His clothes were disheveled, his face streaked with tears, and his eyes wide with panic. He darted toward the front of the room, his small body trembling with fear. Everyone in the courtroom turned their heads, startled by the sudden intrusion. The sheriff at the door tried to move toward the boy, but he was too fast. The boy reached the front of the room and stopped short, standing in the middle of the aisle, his chest heaving from the run. Judge Parker's voice broke the stillness. "Young man, what do you think you're doing? This is a courtroom, not a place for a child to run wild." Her tone was calm but firm, the authority in her voice impossible to ignore. The boy stood there, his body shaking, and wiped away his tears with the back of his hand. He wasn't listening to the judge's words. He was too focused on something far more urgent. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling but desperate. "It's really important. Please." The murmurs around the room intensified as everyone looked at the boy, unsure what to make of this unexpected interruption. Judge Parker's brow furrowed. "Who are you, and why are you here?" she asked, her voice softer now, sensing the urgency in his words. The boy swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Elijah Turner. I'm here because my dad didn't do it. He didn't steal that money." The room fell into stunned silence. The name Elijah Turner was one that many knew. Elijah was the son of Marcus Turner, the man accused of embezzling millions of dollars from a charity organization. Marcus had been adamant about his innocence, but with mounting evidence against him, the public had already condemned him. Elijah's presence in the courtroom now was a shock to everyone, especially as he seemed so sure of his father's innocence. Judge Parker studied the boy carefully, her expression unreadable. She motioned to the sheriff standing near the door. "Please, take this child outside. He has no business being in here," she said, though there was no anger in her tone. The boy's distress was palpable, and something in her demeanor softened. But Elijah refused to move. His feet were planted firmly on the floor, and his eyes locked with Judge Parker's. "I can prove it," he said, his voice now filled with determination. "I know who did it. I know who framed my dad." He stepped forward, his body shaking but his resolve growing stronger. "You have to listen." The judge's expression shifted, her earlier irritation replaced with a cautious curiosity. "You've been listening to the trial?" she asked. "You understand the seriousness of the charges against your father?" Elijah nodded, wiping his eyes. "I know everything. I know the truth. I'm not lying." A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone in the courtroom processed the weight of his words. The defense attorney, Daniel Hayes, stood up, his voice calm but concerned. "Your Honor," he began, "this is highly inappropriate. We can't allow this boy to disrupt the proceedings. This is a legal matter, and—" "I don't care about the law right now," Elijah interrupted, his voice rising. "My dad is innocent. He's been lying in prison for something he didn't do. I have proof." His words were met with a mixture of disbelief and concern, but Elijah wasn't backing down. Judge Parker looked at the boy, her face softening slightly. "You're saying you have proof? Proof of your father's innocence?" "Yes," Elijah said firmly. "I know who framed him. I can tell you who really did it." A hush fell over the courtroom as all eyes turned toward Elijah. It was clear that no one had expected this turn of events. The trial that had seemed to have reached its conclusion was suddenly thrown into disarray, and the boy, who had no business being there, had just made a claim that could change everything. The room was thick with tension. Every eye in the courtroom was now focused on the 12-year-old boy standing at the front, his tear-streaked face full of emotion and determination. Judge Parker, still at the bench, regarded him with an expression of cautious curiosity. The murmurs from the spectators in the gallery filled the air, each whisper a mixture of disbelief and growing intrigue. I need to know what you're saying, Elijah," Judge Parker finally spoke, her voice steady, but there was a softness to it now, a tone that suggested she was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Elijah wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his small body trembling with nervous energy. "My dad, he's innocent. He didn't do it. He didn't steal any money," Elijah repeated, his voice shaking. His eyes were wide and desperate, trying to convey the truth that was so urgent in his heart. "I can prove it. I know who did it. I know who framed him." The courtroom grew dead silent. Even the defense attorney, Daniel Hayes, who had been standing by his table, looked startled by the boy's outburst. The prosecutor, on the other hand, scowled, clearly unsettled by the unexpected turn of events. Judge Parker cleared her throat, her brow furrowing. "You're saying you have proof?" she asked, her voice a bit softer now. "You're not just here to make accusations." "I'm not making this up," Elijah responded, his voice more firm now. "I know exactly what happened. I overheard my dad talking about it before he got arrested. He was talking about a man named Thomas Sinclair. I don't think my dad ever knew who was behind the whole thing, but I overheard enough to know that Thomas Sinclair is the one who framed him." A chill ran through the courtroom. The name Thomas Sinclair was known to many, especially to those who had followed the story of Marcus Turner's trial. Sinclair was the head of the charity that Marcus Turner had worked for. He was a wealthy, influential figure in the city, a man whose name had never been mentioned during the trial in connection with the crime. The defense attorney, Daniel Hayes, stepped forward, visibly unsettled. "Your Honor, this is a child's claim. We cannot take the words of a 12-year-old boy as fact, especially when we've been through months of court hearings, testimonies, and investigations that already point to my client's involvement in the alleged crime." Judge Parker didn't respond immediately. She glanced at Elijah, who was still standing in the center of the courtroom, eyes locked on her. His gaze was unwavering, filled with conviction. After a moment, Judge Parker sighed and addressed the courtroom. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "this child has made a serious claim. A claim that could change the entire course of this trial. I cannot dismiss it outright. Elijah, if what you say is true, we must investigate it further." Elijah nodded, wiping his face one more time before speaking again. "I'm telling the truth. My dad was set up. I know Sinclair had something to do with it. I can't prove it all by myself, but I'm sure the evidence is out there. My dad didn't do this." Judge Parker studied Elijah for a moment before turning her gaze to the prosecutor, who had been silent up until this point. The prosecutor, a tall man named Robert Harris, raised an eyebrow but remained quiet, as if considering his next move. "Your Honor," Harris said slowly, "we cannot let this distraction derail the case. I have a mountain of evidence that implicates Marcus Turner, and frankly, it seems highly unlikely that a young boy could have information that could change the outcome of this trial." Elijah's eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "I'm not lying," he shouted. His voice cracked with the weight of his emotions, but his eyes burned with the truth he was fighting to expose. "My dad was framed. Thomas Sinclair is the real criminal. The tension in the room was palpable as all eyes turned to the judge. She had to decide what to do next. She had the power to allow the case to continue or to call for an immediate investigation into Elijah's claims. Judge Parker closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice steady, "I'm going to allow a short recess so we can look into this new information. Elijah, I want you to stay here with your lawyer. We'll call you back to testify if necessary." The decision was made. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversations and murmurs as people began to process the unexpected twist. Elijah was led to a side bench by his lawyer, who placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. His heart was racing, but a small flicker of hope began to grow inside him. Maybe, just maybe, his father's innocence could finally be proven. The courtroom was abuzz with whispered conversations as the recess began. Elijah sat quietly beside his lawyer, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. He could barely believe that he had stood up in front of everyone and told them the truth. His father was innocent, and he had proof. But now, with the court session halted for investigation, Elijah could only wait. His lawyer, a calm and experienced woman named Patricia Green, leaned toward him and whispered, "You did well, Elijah. You told the truth, and that's all we can ask for." Elijah nodded, though doubt still clouded his mind. "But what if they don't believe me? What if they don't find anything?" "We'll take it one step at a time," Patricia reassured him. "You've given them the starting point. Now we just need to follow through." Outside the courtroom, the investigation was already underway. Elijah's words had set in motion a series of phone calls and private meetings. The name, Thomas Sinclair, was now at the center of the case. The defense team, along with some of the prosecution's resources, began to dig deeper into Sinclair's background, hoping to uncover any hidden connections that could link him to the embezzlement scheme. Hours passed as Elijah sat anxiously, waiting for the next steps. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of his claim hanging over everyone. Finally, Judge Parker entered the room and called the court back to order. The air was thick with anticipation as Elijah stood up, his heart pounding. As everyone settled back into their seats, Judge Parker's eyes scanned the courtroom. She cleared her throat before speaking. "After a preliminary investigation into the claims made by Elijah Turner, we have uncovered some new information that may alter the course of this trial." Elijah's breath caught in his throat as he glanced at his father, who was seated next to his defense attorney. Marcus Turner, once again in the spotlight, looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. His eyes locked with Elijah's, and the briefest smile of reassurance crossed his face. "Mr. Hayes, the defense," Judge Parker continued, turning to the defense attorney, "has presented new evidence that, at the very least, requires us to take a closer look at the role of Mr. Thomas Sinclair in this case. This court has also received a letter, dated 2 weeks before Marcus Turner's arrest. It is addressed to Mr. Turner, and it provides significant information about the real perpetrators behind the crimes he is accused of." A gasp ran through the courtroom. The defense attorney, Daniel Hayes, stood up in shock, his eyes widening as he glanced at the letter being handed to the judge. "This letter, Your Honor," Judge Parker continued, "was discovered at Mr. Turner's home, hidden among his personal belongings. It was evidently overlooked by the investigators who initially combed through the evidence. The letter was carefully passed to the jury and the prosecution." Elijah's heart raced as he watched his father's expression shift from worry to hope. His father had never spoken about this letter, but Elijah had seen it before, tucked into a folder in the back of his father's office. "Let's read the contents," Judge Parker said, beginning to unfold the letter. She paused for a moment, scanning the document. The room was silent, each person waiting for the judge's next words. After a long pause, Judge Parker spoke, her voice even and clear. "This letter was written by Marcus Turner himself. In it, he describes a conversation he had with his colleague, Thomas Sinclair, which took place several months before his arrest. In this letter, Mr. Turner details how Sinclair had pressured him to cover up certain financial discrepancies within the charity organization. Mr. Turner also writes about how Sinclair used him as a scapegoat, framing him for a crime he didn't commit. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elijah felt a rush of relief flood through him. This was the proof they had been waiting for. It was the key that could clear his father's name once and for all. Judge Parker continued reading. The letter goes on to describe a meeting where Mr. Turner was threatened by Sinclair, who made it clear that if he did not take the fall, his family would be in danger. Mr. Turner writes that he had no choice but to comply, fearing for the safety of his loved ones. Elijah felt his stomach churn as the details of his father's struggle became clearer. His father had been trapped in a web of deceit and intimidation, and Elijah had never known the full extent of it. The revelation hit him hard, but it also solidified his belief that his father had done nothing wrong. Judge Parker set the letter down, her gaze now fixed on the courtroom. This letter, along with Elijah Turner's testimony, opens up a new line of inquiry. I am ordering a full investigation into Mr. Sinclair's role in this case, as well as a review of the evidence that was previously ignored. We will also be calling in Mr. Sinclair for questioning. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. They're going to bring him in, he whispered to himself. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. The court session continued, and Elijah watched with a mix of nervousness and excitement as the investigation into Thomas Sinclair began to unfold. His father's name was finally being cleared, and the truth was coming to light. But the journey was far from over. As the session ended for the day, Elijah walked out of the courtroom with his father. For the first time in months, Marcus Turner seemed lighter, hopeful. He placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder as they walked. You did it, son, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved me. I couldn't have done this without you. Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. We did it, Dad. Together. The day after the bombshell revelation in court, the entire legal landscape shifted. The news outlets quickly picked up the story of Elijah Turner, the young boy who had bravely intervened in his father's trial, and the startling letter that had surfaced implicating Thomas Sinclair. It wasn't just a local sensation, it was national news. People were talking about the young boy's courage, about the father who had been wrongly accused, and about a new twist that might just turn the case upside down. Elijah sat in his father's modest apartment later that evening, the weight of everything still sinking in. The letter his father had written, hidden for so long, had become the catalyst for what could potentially be the biggest turning point of their lives. For the first time in months, hope flickered in Elijah's chest. But there was still so much to be done. Sinclair wasn't off the hook yet. Marcus Turner sat at the kitchen table, reading through the new legal documents that had been delivered by the defense team. They were looking at the letter again, trying to determine the next best course of action, but Marcus seemed distant, his mind elsewhere. Elijah noticed his father's worn face, the stress of the past months still apparent. You know, it's hard to believe, Marcus said quietly, looking up from the papers. That letter. I never thought it would come to this. I didn't even remember writing it. Elijah didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them, but he knew there was no turning back now. We're getting closer to the truth, Dad. This is our chance. Marcus gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm proud of you, Elijah. But we can't rest until Sinclair is behind bars. In the days that followed, a full investigation was launched into Thomas Sinclair's actions. The prosecution, though reluctant at first, began to seriously reconsider their stance on Marcus Turner's guilt. There was too much evidence now to ignore. Elijah's testimony, along with the letter, opened up a dangerous path for Sinclair, who had used his powerful position to exploit people for years. The truth was coming out, but they still needed concrete proof that would stand up in court. Patricia Green, Elijah's lawyer, worked tirelessly with the investigation team, combing through the newly opened files, interviewing key witnesses, and following leads that had been previously ignored. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes, the defense attorney, pushed forward with the legal challenge, making sure every angle of the case was explored. But everyone knew that Sinclair was not going to give up easily. He was a powerful man with dangerous connections, and they were all acutely aware that exposing him would make them targets. One afternoon, as Elijah was sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework, Patricia Green called. Her voice was tense, but there was a hint of relief in her words. "Elijah, you need to come down to the office. We've got something big." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He stood up immediately. "What happened?" "We found something crucial, something that could really bring Sinclair down. We need to discuss it in person. Bring your father, too." When they arrived at the office, Patricia and the investigation team were waiting, all of them seated around a large table stacked with files and documents. Patricia motioned for them to sit down. "Good news, I think," she began, looking up at Marcus and Elijah. "We've uncovered records showing that Sinclair was directly involved in laundering money through the charity he ran. But the real kicker is this." She handed a file over to Marcus. It was a bank statement showing several large wire transfers that had been funneled through the charity's accounts. The transactions were traced back to companies that were registered in Sinclair's name, companies he had used to hide his illegal activities. There were also confidential emails between Sinclair and various other parties discussing how to cover up the embezzlement. But the most significant thing was the timing of the transactions. They coincided exactly with the period when Marcus was being set up as the fall guy. Elijah felt his pulse quicken as he looked over the documents. "This is it," he murmured. "This is what we needed." Marcus's hands shook slightly as he looked at the paperwork. "We've got him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is everything." Patricia nodded. "It's not just the money. We also found witness statements from people who saw Sinclair moving large amounts of cash around the same time Marcus was arrested. It all adds up. We have enough to put him in prison for a long time." Later that evening, as the investigation into Sinclair continued, Elijah couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. The truth was finally coming to light. But the weight of the fight was far from over. The case wasn't closed yet. The trial was still underway, and Sinclair was a formidable adversary. He still had the power to manipulate people, to bribe, to intimidate. But Elijah was resolute. He had come too far to stop now. His father was innocent, and they were going to make sure the world knew the truth. The next day, Elijah, his father, and their lawyer gathered once again in the courtroom. The prosecution was now ready to move forward with the charges against Thomas Sinclair. The courtroom was tense, and Elijah could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. This was it, the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. The next morning, Elijah stood outside the courthouse, the early light of the sun casting long shadows across the steps. His father, Marcus, stood beside him, a rare moment of calm on his usually tense face. Today was the day. The day they would confront Thomas Sinclair in court. The day they would bring the truth to light. Elijah's heart raced, a mixture of nerves and anticipation flooding his chest. He'd been through so much already, but this was the final step. He had no idea how Sinclair would react when he was finally confronted with the evidence, but he knew that they couldn't let him slip away again. "It's going to be okay," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We've done everything we can, Elijah. You've done everything you could. Now we let the truth speak for itself." Elijah nodded but didn't speak. He was still processing everything. They had proof, undeniable proof, and today, Thomas Sinclair would have to face the consequences of his actions. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery was full, the murmurs of spectators floating around as they awaited the arrival of the key players. Elijah sat with his father, Patricia Green, and Daniel Hayes, his lawyer, at the defense table. Across from them, at the prosecution table, sat the familiar face of Robert Harris, the prosecutor who had been relentlessly pushing for Marcus's conviction. Judge Amelia Parker entered, and the room fell silent. She took her seat, and with a calm voice, called the court to order. "Today, we proceed with the case of Marcus Turner," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I have reviewed the new evidence presented in the past few days, and it has come to light that there are significant discrepancies with the original investigation. Therefore, I am calling Thomas Sinclair to the stand. Mr. Sinclair, please approach the witness stand." Elijah's pulse quickened as Sinclair stood up from his seat in the back. The once confident and composed man now seemed visibly uneasy. His tailored suit did little to hide the stiff movements of his body. The smirk that often accompanied his arrogant persona was gone. He stepped to the witness stand, his eyes briefly meeting Elijah's before he turned his attention to the judge. "Mr. Sinclair," Judge Parker began, her tone neutral but firm, "you are being called to testify regarding your involvement in the events that have led to the accusations against Marcus Turner. We have evidence suggesting that you played a role in orchestrating the embezzlement scheme for which Mr. Turner was wrongfully accused. Please state your full name for the record." Thomas Sinclair took a deep breath, his jaw clenched tightly. "Thomas Sinclair," he said in a low, steady voice. "And I stand by the fact that Marcus Turner is guilty of the crimes he's accused of." A gasp ran through the courtroom, but Judge Parker quickly silenced it with a raise of her hand. "Mr. Sinclair," she said calmly, "you are under oath. I advise you to be honest in your testimony. We have substantial evidence that contradicts your statement." Elijah couldn't help but watch as Sinclair shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was trying to maintain his composure, but the pressure was mounting. Patricia Green, who was sitting next to Elijah, leaned in and whispered, "This is it. He won't be able to deny it for much longer." Sinclair was now under intense scrutiny. The defense presented the letter that Marcus had written, the key document that revealed Sinclair's involvement in framing Marcus. The evidence was undeniable. Elijah had done his part, and now it was time for Sinclair to face the consequences. Patricia stood up, signaling that they were ready to cross-examine Sinclair. "Mr. Sinclair," she began, her voice calm but unwavering, "you've had the chance to deny your involvement in these crimes, but the evidence against you is mounting. The letter from Marcus Turner clearly states that you coerced him into taking the fall for the crimes you committed. How do you explain that?" Sinclair's face hardened, his eyes flickering briefly in Elijah's direction before he looked away. He cleared his throat. "I did not coerce Marcus Turner. He was an integral part of the organization. We were simply trying to cover up some mistakes. I did what I had to do to protect the charity, to protect my reputation." "Your reputation?" Patricia repeated, her voice rising. "What about Marcus Turner's reputation? What about his life? You destroyed his life to protect yourself. You used him as a scapegoat for your own criminal activity. You think you can just sweep this under the rug?" Sinclair's eyes darted nervously, his composure faltering for a moment. "I did what I thought was best. No one was supposed to find out about the discrepancies. I had to keep the organization running smoothly." "You were embezzling money, Mr. Sinclair." Patricia pressed. "You were using the charity's funds for your own gain. You manipulated and framed an innocent man to save your own skin." The room was tense, every word echoing as Sinclair's defense crumbled before their eyes. His confidence was quickly evaporating, replaced by fear as the weight of his actions caught up with him. Elijah's heart was pounding as he watched the scene unfold. For the first time, it seemed like Sinclair's ironclad facade was cracking. He had seen the man for what he was all along, a liar, a manipulator, and a criminal. But now the world would see him for who he truly was. Finally, Sinclair lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen. But I couldn't let the charity fall apart. I couldn't let everything I built be destroyed." Patricia Green didn't miss a beat. So you destroyed an innocent man's life to save yourself? Sinclair didn't answer. He couldn't. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. It was clear now that Thomas Sinclair had been cornered. The truth had come to light. The case was no longer about Marcus Turner's guilt, it was about the truth, and it was finally coming to fruition. As the judge called for a short recess to deliberate, Elijah looked at his father. They had done it. They had exposed Sinclair's lies. Marcus gave Elijah a tight smile, his voice full of emotion. You did it, son. You saved me. Elijah smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. We did it together, Dad. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final pieces of the puzzle came together. Elijah sat in the front row, his body tense, his mind racing. The day had arrived, the culmination of months of pain, doubt, and uncertainty. Today, Thomas Sinclair would face the consequences of his actions. Elijah had done everything he could to expose the truth, but now, the final verdict rested in the hands of the jury. Elijah glanced over at his father, Marcus, who was sitting beside him, his expression one of quiet resolve. The weight of the trial had been heavy on both of them, but now, there was a sense of hope that had not been present before. Marcus had always maintained his innocence, but it was only now, with all the evidence coming to light, that the world would finally know the truth. Judge Amelia Parker entered the courtroom, her commanding presence filling the space. The murmur of the crowd quieted instantly as she took her seat at the bench. She looked over at the defense and the prosecution before speaking. We have come to the final moments of this trial, she began. The jury has heard the evidence, and we are now ready to hear the closing arguments. Mr. Hayes, please proceed. Daniel Hayes, the defense attorney, stood up and addressed the court with a composed expression. He was a seasoned lawyer, but today, there was a certain urgency to his words. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hayes began, what we have before us is not just a case of embezzlement. This is a case of a man, Marcus Turner, who was wrongfully accused of crimes he did not commit. The evidence we have uncovered, particularly the letter written by Mr. Turner himself, proves that he was set up by Thomas Sinclair, a man who used his power and influence to manipulate and frame an innocent man. Hayes paused, letting his words sink in. I implore you to consider the truth, not just the accusations. Marcus Turner deserves his freedom. He deserves justice. And he deserves to be exonerated today. The courtroom was silent as Hayes returned to his seat. Elijah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but there was still a lingering uncertainty. When it was time for the prosecution's closing statement, Robert Harris stood up, his expression stern, his voice unwavering. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented overwhelming evidence that Marcus Turner was directly involved in the embezzlement scheme. We have seen the financial records, the transactions, and the testimony of those who worked with Mr. Turner. The letter presented by the defense is nothing more than a desperate attempt to shift the blame. We cannot allow a child's words or a hastily written letter to undo the truth. Harris's words rang out, each syllable meant to convince the jury of Marcus's guilt. But Elijah could feel the cracks in his argument. The evidence against Sinclair was undeniable. The letter from Marcus, the bank statements, and the witness testimonies were all pieces of the puzzle that proved his father's innocence. The jury filed out of the courtroom, and the room fell into a tense silence. Elijah sat, his fingers clutched tightly around the edge of the table. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to his family, the lies, the manipulations, the pain. It had all led to this moment. He looked over at his father, who had a grim yet hopeful expression on his face. We did everything we could, Marcus said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. Now we just have to wait. Minutes turned into hours as the courtroom waited for the jury's decision. Elijah could barely keep still, his mind racing. Would they believe the truth? Would they see through Sinclair's lies? Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the foreperson entered, holding the verdict in hand. The room fell silent as the foreperson approached the judge. Judge Parker stood up, her voice firm. The jury has reached a verdict. Please, read the verdict aloud. The foreperson cleared their throat before speaking. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Turner, not guilty of all charges. A wave of relief and disbelief washed over Elijah as he heard the words. The weight that had been crushing his chest for months finally lifted. His father was free. It was over. The courtroom erupted into applause, but Elijah barely heard it. His mind was spinning, his body shaking with the adrenaline of the moment. He turned to look at his father, who was already standing up, a look of disbelief on his face. Marcus's eyes met Elijah's, and in that instant, the floodgates opened. Tears filled Marcus's eyes as he pulled his son into an embrace. We did it, Elijah, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. We did it. Elijah hugged his father back, his own tears streaming down his face. They had been through so much, and now, after everything, they had won. His father was finally free, and the truth had come to light. Later that day, as the two of them left the courthouse, Elijah felt a sense of weightlessness. It was as if the world had shifted beneath his feet, and everything that had seemed impossible was now within reach. Marcus turned to his son, a proud smile on his face. You're my hero, Elijah, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved me. You saved us both. Elijah smiled through his tears. We saved each other, Dad. The days that followed were filled with interviews, press conferences, and the overwhelming support of the community. The story of Marcus Turner's wrongful conviction and Elijah's brave action spread across the nation, becoming a symbol of justice and the power of truth. As for Elijah, he realized that this was only the beginning of his journey. He had proven that no matter how young or small you were, you could make a difference. The fight for justice didn't end here, it had only just begun. And for the first time in years, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him. He and his father had faced the darkness together, and now, they could finally begin to rebuild their lives. The days following the trial were a blur of media attention, interviews, and public recognition. Elijah had expected some level of notoriety, but the reality of it was overwhelming. His name, his father's name, and their story were now national news. The headlines blared across TV screens and newspapers, Boy Saves Father, Exposes Corruption at Charity. Elijah wasn't sure how to feel about it all. Part of him wanted the world to know the truth about his father's innocence, but part of him just wanted to go back to a quiet life, one where they could live without constantly looking over their shoulders. Hey, Marcus said one evening, as they sat in their small apartment, away from the spotlight for a brief moment. He sat down beside Elijah on the couch, his face tired but content. How are you holding up? Elijah looked at his father. His dad was no longer the man weighed down by the accusations and prison time. He looked lighter, relieved, like a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. But Elijah could see the weariness in his eyes. I'm okay, Elijah said, his voice soft. I just don't want things to change too much. I want us to be normal again. Marcus smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Normal? He laughed quietly. Son, after everything we've been through, there's no such thing as normal. But we can build something new. Something better. Elijah nodded, the weight of the world suddenly feeling a little less heavy. The truth had been revealed, and the court had done its part. But now, it was up to them to rebuild their lives. The next few weeks were spent out of the spotlight. Marcus and Elijah had agreed to lay low for a while, taking time to process everything that had happened. They moved into a small but cozy house on the outskirts of town, far away from the media frenzy. It was a fresh start, a chance to escape the noise and focus on what really mattered. Marcus had found a new job at a law firm, not the same high-powered position he'd had before the scandal, but it was honest work. He was working his way back up, piece by piece, and Elijah was proud of how hard his father was working to build a new life. He wasn't going to let the past define him anymore. For the first time in years, Marcus felt hopeful. His confidence was returning, and he had a new determination to make up for the lost years, not only for himself but for Elijah as well. One afternoon, as Elijah was doing his homework in the living room, his father came in with a newspaper. He held it up, smiling. "I think you should see this," Marcus said, his voice teasing. Elijah frowned, wondering what his dad was talking about. He put down his pen and took the paper from his father's hands. On the front page was a picture of him, Elijah, standing beside Marcus after the trial, both of them with smiles of relief and pride. The headline read, "Teenager who exposed scandal becomes local hero." Elijah rolled his eyes, a slight blush creeping onto his cheeks. "I didn't do this for fame," he said, slightly embarrassed. Marcus chuckled. "I know you didn't. But it's still something to be proud of. You made a difference. You changed everything." Elijah smiled back at his father, though he couldn't fully absorb the impact of what he had done. It was still hard for him to accept that his actions had changed the course of their lives, and maybe even the lives of others. Meanwhile, Thomas Sinclair's world had come crashing down. The new evidence that had been brought to light, the witness testimonies, and the financial records had sealed his fate. He was arrested and charged with embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud. His trial would be long and drawn out, but everyone knew that justice was finally catching up with him. As the trial against Sinclair continued, the media shifted its focus. No longer was Marcus Turner the villain. The narrative had changed. Sinclair was now the face of corruption, and the story of Elijah's bravery inspired people across the nation. But for Elijah and Marcus, this new chapter wasn't about public recognition. It was about healing, about putting the past behind them, and about rebuilding their relationship. They still had so much work to do, but now they had hope. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset, Elijah turned to his father. "Do you think things will ever go back to the way they were?" he asked. Marcus looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "No, I don't think so. But maybe that's a good thing." He paused, as if considering the words carefully. "We've been through hell, Elijah. But we've come out of it stronger. We've got a chance to do things differently now. We can make our own path." Elijah nodded. "Yeah. A new start." His father smiled warmly at him. "Exactly. A new beginning, just for us." And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt at peace. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Together, they would rebuild not just their lives, but their bond as father and son. They had both faced the darkness and come out into the light, and now, with the truth finally revealed, they could move forward. It had been 6 months since the trial, and life had started to find a rhythm again. The media buzz had died down, the public had moved on to other stories, but for Marcus and Elijah Turner, things had shifted in a way they never expected. The scars of the past remained, but now they were just reminders of their resilience. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, staring out the window at the morning sunlight filtering through the trees. The world outside seemed peaceful, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the stillness. Elijah walked into the room, carrying his school bag and looking slightly distracted, his head buried in his phone. "Dad, I got an email from the university," he said, excitement bubbling in his voice. "They accepted my application for the summer program. I'm in." Marcus' head snapped toward his son, a proud smile spreading across his face. Elijah had always been focused on his future, even before everything fell apart. Now, watching him embrace new opportunities with such enthusiasm made Marcus feel a sense of pride he hadn't fully allowed himself to feel in years. "That's amazing, Elijah," Marcus said, his voice full of emotion. "You've worked so hard for this. I'm really proud of you." Elijah smiled, putting his phone down. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without your support. I mean, after everything, I didn't think things would ever get back to normal, but it feels like a fresh start." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We both got a fresh start. And you've earned it, Elijah. You fought for your father, for the truth. You've already proven you can do anything." Elijah's eyes softened as he gazed at his father. "We did it together." Over the next few months, Marcus continued to rebuild his life. He had a new job at a small but respected law firm, helping those who had been wronged by a system too often stacked against them. He'd gone from being the accused to the advocate, using his experience to help others navigate the legal system. It wasn't the life he had envisioned when he was younger, but it was a life he could be proud of. He spent time with Elijah, enjoying their peaceful moments together, whether it was working on homework, talking about their days, or just sitting quietly at the table, like they were today. But as the weeks passed, Marcus started to feel an itch, a feeling that there was more he could do. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Marcus took the first step toward his new purpose. He walked into a local community center, a place that had been a lifeline for many people in their city. He had visited the center once before to donate clothes and food, but today, he was there for something bigger. A community organizer named Karen was at the front desk when Marcus walked in. She looked up, surprised to see him, but gave him a warm smile. "Mr. Turner, it's good to see you. How can we help you today?" "I want to help," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of intent. "I've been through a lot in the past few years, and I know what it's like to be wrongfully accused. I want to use what I've learned to help people who need a voice." Karen studied him for a moment, sensing the sincerity in his words. "We've been looking for someone who can mentor people caught in the system, especially those who've been wrongfully accused. There's a lot of need here. We'd be honored to have you on board." Marcus smiled, a sense of purpose rising in his chest. "Then I'm in." Elijah watched with pride as his father poured his heart into his new work. Marcus wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was creating a new legacy, a legacy of helping others who were trapped in situations he had once been a part of. Every week, Marcus spent hours at the community center, mentoring young people, helping them understand their legal rights, and offering support to those who had been failed by the system. Marcus had found his new calling, and Elijah was right by his side, proud of the man his father had become. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was one they could both be proud of. One afternoon, Elijah came home from the summer program and found his father sitting at the kitchen table, a piece of paper in front of him. "What's that?" Elijah asked, intrigued. Marcus pushed the paper toward him, a big smile on his face. "It's the first draft of a book I've been working on. It's about wrongful convictions, about what it's like to be falsely accused and to fight for the truth. I want to share my story, but I also want to give people who've been through the same thing a voice." Elijah's eyes lit up. "Dad, that's amazing. You're writing a book?" Marcus nodded. "I think it's time to tell my story. And to help others tell theirs." As Marcus continued to build his new life and purpose, Elijah also began to carve his own path. With the support of his father and the lessons he had learned from their shared struggle, Elijah was determined to make the most of every opportunity. The university summer program turned into a scholarship offer, and before long, Elijah was applying to colleges with a clear vision of his future. He wanted to become a lawyer, someone who would fight for justice the way his father had. As they sat together one evening, talking about the future, Marcus couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for his son. Elijah had grown into a young man full of potential, ready to take on the world with the same courage and strength that had seen them through their darkest days. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, son," Marcus said, his voice full of emotion. "Don't let anything stop you." Elijah looked at his father, his eyes filled with determination. "We've both come a long way, Dad. I'm not going to stop now. The journey that had started with betrayal, loss, and fear had led them both to a place of peace, purpose, and hope. Marcus and Elijah Turner had fought for the truth, and now they were building a new life based on that truth. They had faced the darkest moments of their lives, but they had emerged stronger, more connected, and ready to embrace whatever came next. Together, they had created a legacy, not of pain or fear, but of courage, justice, and the belief that no matter how difficult the journey, there was always hope for a new beginning. The ending of this story is both emotional and empowering. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of truth, the strength of family, and the resilience that can come from facing adversity head-on. Elijah's unwavering belief in his father's innocence and his courage to expose the truth ultimately lead to a new beginning for both of them. The healing and growth they experience reflect the profound impact that justice and redemption can have on a family. What did you think of the ending? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more captivating stories that will keep you hooked. Thank you for watching.